Hi, thanks for tuning in. And on this episode, we're going to be talking about project management. Uh, Something that we don't always get too deep into here on the Jet Rails podcast, but I've got Matthew here with me from the Leventis team, and we're going to be diving into project management styles and where a lot of the industry, as it would happen to be, whether it's for completely custom projects or whether it's for content management system-based projects, e-commerce projects, where the industry's been evolving in recent years, and certainly I'll be picking Matthew's brain on what's been working for himself and the teams he's been involved with. With no further ado, Matthew, would you do the honor of introducing yourself?
Yeah, sure. I'm Matt Krecker. I'm from Leventis Incorporated, which is a consulting firm in Illinois. I've been working as an engineer, as a senior engineer now for about 15 years. Before that, I worked in publishing, in sort of operations in a small publishing company, then made a switch to software engineering. And I've been working mostly, I've spent time as a consultant at consulting firms. I've spent time in big corporations, spent time in smaller corporations. So I've been in several different places.
It's always interesting how I think in today's day and age, you can't really plan where you're going to be 10 years out, what the industry is going to look like, what company is going to meld into what, and exactly where we'll all be needed and what capacity. I happen to enjoy that part of the industry, and I think that's almost part of the fun these days. You plan to be somewhere for a long time, but even what that organization does can really evolve through the years.
Yeah, very quickly. Yeah.
So, and speaking of evolution, in your earlier years in dealing with project management, what type of style was commonly being implemented in the projects that you were involved in?
Well, when I started out, there was no style, because it was, like I said, I started out in a publishing company, kind of doing some IT stuff and some operational stuff, making sure books got out and published and invoices got sent out and things like that. It was just kind of chaos. And so the goal day to day was just do things to bring order to chaos as you could, because this wasn't a big company with tons of resources. So when it came time to figure out a way to ship books out with barcodes, because we were self-publishing manuals and teacher's guides and things like that. It was educational publishing. Then it became a project where we said, okay, start from scratch, figure out what you're doing, and if it doesn't work, do something else until you got stuff shipped out with barcodes and we could track inventory better. Then, it's sort of a career change. I just sort of full-time went into sort of engineering, where that was a sort of a professional thing. I wasn't just working somewhere. I was working as an engineer, as that sort of, I don't know what you call it, that sort of, that profession. Mm-hmm. And, I, as a consultant, I went to lots of different companies. And in one point, I went to JP Morgan Chase. And that style was absolutely the opposite of chaos. It was a waterfall method from start to finish, to the point of, if you were in one phase and you'd exited the previous phase, it was a big deal to talk to anybody about the previous phase. Like it was truly a waterfall.
It's one directional.
It was more like
we've planned it out, and it's going to be executed as it was planned.
It's sort of like, if you ever seen like a documentary about like the Panama Canal or something, they've got locks, right? So they raise the water and the ship moves, and they lower the water and the ship moves, and they raise it again and the ship moves. And imagine having to go back 2 steps. That's what it felt like. It's lowering the water and moving the ship backwards and raising the water again and moving the ship backwards. And it just really felt like it was the worst thing you could do to say, I got to talk to the person who did the design, because this doesn't make sense, right? You had to schedule a meeting, you had to talk to people. And it was, it's hard to say it didn't work. And this, I think, is the biggest obstacle to doing anything differently, because as you work with waterfall, with that traditional style of project management that goes back to, IBM in the 70s and developing IT projects back that far, you just feel so oppressed, right? But it kind of works, right? It was a really huge project that processed millions and millions of things every day. So it's kind of hard to turn around and say, gee, we should have done this with Agile, right?
Well, and there's nothing unusual. You hire a contractor to work in your house and you agree that this is the labor, this is the timeline, this is the work that's going to be completed. And, we're all used to things like that where there's an understanding of what that project flow is going to look like and what the expectations are. I think that the problem that comes into play with waterfall is that the expectations are so rigid. And I think this is what the industry has come to, of course, not so much about me, that when there has to be adjustment for any number of reasons, things get very tense. And, if you give someone exactly what they wanted or expected on day one, and it's now, let's say, a 3-month project, and what their needs and expectations are may have changed a bit. And that sounds counterintuitive. It's like, but that's what they ordered. But, that's okay when you order food in a restaurant. You expect it to come out the way that you ordered it, a half hour ago or 20 minutes, whatever a reasonable. I don't know, when's the last time I went to a restaurant under lockdown? Who remembers anymore? But on the flip side, when it's a bigger, more complex project, until you see something sometime, or until there's a market shift, you don't even realize that what you're going to really want as your deliverable is going to be a little different. So
people, one of the things I always say is people don't know what they want until they have it.
Yeah,
and once they have it, they probably want something else. Yeah. And it's just because it's not like a restaurant. You can't look at a picture and say, I want that, and have it come out more or less looking like that. Right? It's not going to look like what the picture is. It's going to, you don't know. You just don't know.
Well, imagine you were building an e-commerce website before this lockdown, and now you need curbside checkout, and so, if you were trying to follow a waterfall method and deliver exactly what the original plan was, which often happens. And there are still absolutely businesses that will say, look, this is the scope of work. We have to finish this first before we can look at anything else, because otherwise it's just going to keep changing. And, you have a fixed price from us or some other billing model that doesn't really allow for that. And we need to be able to get this project off of our workbench because we've got to take on the next ones then. And we can deal with this in phase 2 or after the fact. So sometimes, it's in other cases, I'd say the opposite, so curbside checkout, something that you'd add, you might say, that's all that we really need right now. And so these other features that we were going to deal with, they don't matter as much, because, we're not so worried about the integration of dealing with in-store returns because nobody's coming in-store to return anything right now. We'll deal with that one down the road. So I think, that's where people sometimes have a hard time understanding that that's not often the exception to the rule when it comes to the industry that we're in. It is the rule. The rule is that something is going to be in flux and changing.
I mean, lots of things change. Requirements change, technologies change, your capacities change. There's so much that can change. And so, I think what really made me sort of become a believer in Agile, and I've been a Scrum Master off and on for the last 10 years, Scrum Master and engineer, partly just because being a Scrum Master tends to go to someone who's like a senior engineer anyway. Mm-hmm. Not always, but often. It's the kind of thing you can do and be an engineer on a team. So it kind of worked out that way. But I think what really sold me was just thinking back to that first company I was at and how, when we had to figure something out, we ended up getting it done fairly quickly. And seeing all the the hoops people have to jump through to get something done where you've got this rigid process that has to be followed with dates, you just realize we're not going to know how to do this. There's too many unknowns. There's too many things that can change. There's too many problems that might crop up, much less just having a product that won't quite work. I mean, it just never made going to see some of these big corporations where we worked in this rigid waterfall model. And I was as a consultant. So my company sent, a team out and we just worked within whatever system they had. Seeing it up close, when we started to learn more about Agile as a company and sort of get trained so we could offer as a project management option to clients for the ones where we're building a whole project out for, it was almost immediate. I realized this is how things get done. And it's not so much because the Agile methodology is so perfect. It's not so much because the Agile manifesto was so wonderful. It's just because if you ever have had to get something done where you didn't quite know how it was going to get done, but you had a general idea of what it was supposed to look like when you were finished, you were doing Agile, right? Mm-hmm. You didn't even dare say, okay, this is the plan from start to finish for the next month. You said, okay, let's start here and see if we can do this. And maybe you can, maybe you can't. Then you moved on to the next thing. Well, maybe we can do this. And when you had a problem, you said, well, who knows about X, Y, or Z? Who can handle this? And yeah, some people who were, stronger at one thing might work on the same kind of thing over and over again, the same way someone who's strong at testing tests everything, or someone who's strong at getting requirements and talking to customers might go get all the requirements. But still, it was sort of just, here's a pile of stuff. We got to construct something out of it. Just, pick a job. And that's why I think when people get sold on Agile, I think it's because they have that kind of experience in some way. Even either personal experience, a guided work experience. One person, a coach we had at our company, had the experience of working for, I think it was Habitat for Humanity, where they do a lot of prefab type houses. And it was just, they go for a weekend, they go somewhere, and they have a weekend to put together this prefab house. And he just realized when we get it done, it's because we have this sort of Agile methodology. You have a ticket, you have a job, you pick it up, you do it, you move on to the next one, you talk a lot, you figure out what everyone's doing. And it ends up that Agile is a structure. The Agile methodology that people get sold and talked about and what people go to classes for is a structure that just sort of brings order to what people do when they have to do something well, when they have to get something done. You know what I mean?
Well,
it's not even...
In a lot of ways, it's second nature. If your boss says, I need you to get, X done, and the next day, you know what, I know I said this, but it's got to be this way, that, the client's going to expect it to... You do what you have to do. I think that's really all it's... the word Agile speaks volumes, that it's philosophically... it's built around providing value. So what actually needs to happen here for this project to come to fruition, for whatever stakeholders are involved to get an appropriate value out of it, to see more satisfaction out of it as opposed to less. When all is said and done, when you're trying to measure, whatever metrics of success for a project, you talked about being a Scrum master, Scrum being more of a methodology to get the stuff done,
right.
Using the Agile philosophy, and so that's part of where I love, when people read the manuals and, it has to be done exactly this way. And it's like, no, go back to the word that's at the center of all this, Agile. It doesn't have to be any exact way. There are things that generally work. And so whether you're going to do it exactly like you mentioned, I know some that'll say, have a dedicated QA person, but others that, documentation, others that'll say, that the dev team should have individuals within the team testing their own work, and they should all be learning from each other. And they should be taking turns with that it really depends on what work you're doing and what your team looks like. And that there is no perfect, there's what works.
Among the other sort of rules for Agile teams is, when you actually try to put it in practice, is that typically it's best if an Agile team has one project, right? They're not jumping between 7 different things. And I think the reason is because to make this work, you really have to know what you're trying to do. So like when I've stood up teams before, and I've stood up 3 or 4 different places, it's the first question you have to answer is, what are we doing? Like, truly, what are we trying to deliver? Because it might not be software, right? The sort of standard example that's given in trainings and coaching and writing and so on is, you're going to build a website. You're going to build a website, and it's going to be public, it's going to have users. But, I think out of the 100 projects I've been on, maybe 10 have been public websites, right? I mean, they're just not that common, really, when you think about all the different, well, they're common, but I mean, when you think about all the different things an IT team might have to do. One team had absolutely nothing to do with anything public. It was just all internal console apps and SSIS packages. Another team was devoted entirely to security. Other teams were devoted to internal applications where the customer was your colleagues.
Mm-hmm.
And so you weren't having to think about things like, well, maybe they're using any kind of browser. What kind of demands might they make? What kind of requests might they have? They were just employees like you.
Yeah.
They had a job to do and you had to help them, right? So a lot of those examples kind of break down in the real world. But the fundamental thing is you've got to say, okay, what's this team doing? And then the roles can fall into place. There was no real use for like a traditional QA person when we were doing security stuff. Just because, well, we needed regression testing, but that was it. Just because these weren't features to test. And there was no documentation either. We weren't documenting anything. We were looking at security issues that we had from various analysis and penetration tests. We had to fix them. We didn't need someone to document it, or we didn't need a dedicated person.
Yeah.
But then other times, we had a process that was so complicated, building it for internal users, we needed 3 QA people, and that wasn't enough. As Scrum Master, I kind of stepped in and helped with automated tests, right? Just because that was what was demanded. So I think the fundamental question with Agile is, what are you doing? And hopefully it's just one or maybe 2 things, because then you can really get down to that, get to answering that question and get to work in the right way.
Well, and, the role of the Scrum Master, it's to people that aren't familiar, it's a funny sounding title, but it's really meant to have someone involved that's going to clear roadblocks, that is going to make sure that the project keeps moving forward, because there can be roadblocks. And if the developers are stuck somewhere because they don't have a piece of software, or they don't have approval somewhere, or something's going on that's breaking, or there's bad communication within the team, or sometimes it takes someone that's going to basically coach through it, or that's basically going to advocate for them to the outside world and say, look, either we get either we do X or we get X, or this is not going to move along the way that everyone's hoping.
Right.
Those sorts of concepts, I think, are really interesting toward having a feedback loop that's intended to stop things from breaking down. Because breakdown is intrinsically the problem. When you think about a really big project, so a lot of the apps that we all have on our Androids and iPhones and such, we get pushed out updates for these large popular apps, whether it's a social media platform like Facebook or an email system like Gmail, whatever it might be. Frequently, and you can easily see how there's a team behind it using this kind of methodology. Right. They prioritize what the tasks are, and they're constantly releasing things that are considered of value. They don't have to wait for one big release every night as you update. As you sleep, your phone is updating. Installing some things while it's charging. This is all quite natural, and I'm with you when you get down to those smaller website projects. Depending on the size of the project, sometimes it can be difficult to have a team dedicated to one project. Let's say it's right. It's a project that's 200 hours of work, and there's going to be some gaps in there where maybe you're waiting on the client to give approvals or provide some kind of whether it's content or something along the way.
Right.
Well, what's that team going to be doing if there's no other projects that they're working on? And so, you can imagine that that this breaks down for a lot of agencies that deal with SMB and mid-market, and it can be harder to dedicate to just one single project, but it doesn't mean that the methodology doesn't work. It just means that there's a little bit more juggling to happen in the process.
Right.
I think that at that point, like you say, that the way that a lot of the higher level books and documentation on this process are written, they don't necessarily start with that as the prime example of having to juggle multiple projects.
Yeah. It's it's difficult. When I was at one point when I was working at a big bank, I primarily worked with the .NET stack, C#, Microsoft. They switched their technology stack to Java and Oracle. Right, where I didn't have a lot of experience. So for a while, I was nothing but a Scrum Master. And I was frustrated because if you're doing your job right as a Scrum Master, you can be done by noon, right? You have your stand up in the morning, and if you're good at getting rid of roadblocks and you've cleared away, and people have sort of gotten the team established, there are points where I kind of had nothing to do. that was a little frustrating. And you always have the problem, though, even if you've got, several teams all working together on a real big project, or one team working on a small project that might not take all their time. You always have the issue of, I don't want to call it downtime, but sort of lost time. Because one of the principles of Agile is that you don't try to meet a deliverable 6 months down the road. You try to meet a deliverable every 2 weeks. Or 3 or 4.
Yeah,
I would say
said,
2 weeks.
they would,
whatever you said.
The term being sprints, whether it's every week or whether it's every month. That you basically set out and say these are going to be our deliverables in that time period, and not that they're immovable, but you're working in earnest toward those, and you've prioritized them. So we really need to knock out A, B, and C top priorities, and then we'll keep working down the list for this time block for this sprint.
Right.
And with that, you're always delivering value. There's always something that's going to come off of the to-do list that's of the most importance.
Right. And one of the issues, though, is that once you've delivered, if your sprint's not over, what do you do? And if you have a sprint and you need to deliver things, what do you do about things that you can't deliver in a sprint? Like, how do you research a new technology or research something new? That's kind of an ongoing problem I've noticed. The way I've always solved it is that you just make clear, on average, this team is going to deliver a certain amount of work. However it breaks down. One of the reasons why you do Agile is to break down tasks into smaller pieces. One of the things that ends up is you break down tasks into smaller pieces. And so you end up, just because it's the nature of communication and the way you're sort of coached to talk about things when you have to get things done in smaller deliverables, you end up sort of setting a pace for your team. So people can predict your pace, and it might be 20 tasks if that's how they break down. It might be 5 stories if that's how. It just depends how you break down. Different
some
jobs
people
you have to
use
do.
Points and say, look, our velocity. This team can get 40 points knocked out in a 2-week sprint, in a 2-week time period, and and you figure out then that you break down those tasks and you say, look, I've heard it talked about, like, everything, from rocks. So you've got your boulders, your big tasks that are a lot of points. And then you've got your little, gravel or sand that fills in between those rocks.
Right.
And so that you've got your big tasks and you've got other things to fill in around it as you're waiting on feedback or there's other things going on.
Right.
And so you stay pretty full. And ideally, in a lot of cases, if you've run out of tasks, if you beat expectation, you just grab more from the top of the list of what else is going to happen. That doesn't always work out, but
so one of the objections to that, so typically in Agile, you'll have 2 weeks and you'll set your deliverables, and you're going to deliver 3 things. The goal is that you go into production with something. You can't always do that because you might not be in a situation where you go into production that often. But, one of the reasons why, one of the virtues of Agile is you discipline the expectations of the business owner, right? Because when you set expectations about velocity, you set the expectations of the business owner that you're going to get typically X amount of visible work done, right? And it's going to be represented somehow in a story somehow. And what that allows you to do is, and if you're, I think, doing it well, you can do this. What it allows like a Scrum Master to do is advocate for the team and say to the business owner, look, we're not going to get as much done these next 2 sprints. That's because we need to research how to do this thing that we probably will use. We need a prototype, though, and we need time away from just handling the deliverable just to work on this. So you tell people this is going to be our velocity for the next 2 sprints. We just have to cut back, or we have to cut back because we have to deploy things, or we have to cut back because there's some other priority or for some other project. Or if you have juggling multiple projects or multiple clients, you say, okay, we're going to keep working on this for 8 sprints, let's say, to get your project out for client 1. But we're going to have to slow our velocity down here just because we have other needs we need to fill, which happen to be client 2 and client 3, right? I think that's the real virtue. One of the real virtues of Agile is that it disciplines expectations and allows them to reset on a regular basis, typically a 2-week sprint, but 1 week or 3 weeks or whatever you have. And I think that when I say discipline the expectations, it also, that some of it's just making communication something more than just words. Communication is a behavior. It's It's something that it's actions that you can see. In 2 weeks, you will have this. It's something you can like point to. It's not just we're saying we'll get this far. We'll point to these deliverables. And yes, it's less than you did the last sprint, but it's going to be a little bit more, a couple sprints when we get back rolling on this after we finish our research. So Agile is fundamentally, I think, solving a communication problem. And part of that is communicating to the business owner what to expect in the amount of time that you're taking to get something done.
I think that's really well stated. It's not how I always think of it, but I like it. And in terms of those communications, it's also, you're treating the client as a stakeholder in the project.
Right.
And
Absolutely,
so they're
yes.
giving feedback, but there's understanding that there are other forces at play. And while they're stakeholders, they don't necessarily understand exactly, what their needs are or how to get there themselves, and they're relying on you to assist with that more technical side of it. And so when talking about points, they're often talked about as story points, and that's because you're breaking down the deliverables into stories. Okay, let's not just say we need a feature that does X. Let's actually talk about what the user interaction is going to be and what it's going to look like on the back end. And, what does it actually need to do? Because so often that's a breaking point that, you read a proposal and it says this project is going to have, reward points. And the client thinks that means that there's a reward point system that's going to work between their retail store's point of sale software and their e-commerce website, and that those are synced and work. And that's not, they're just living, in the sales process that was never understood. And so breaking things down into, into better communication, certainly I think elevates a lot of the process outside of what of what some experiences can be. And in so many industries, everybody talks about you got to pick 2 out of 3. You could have quality, you could have speed, you can have price, you can have cost. I think that this process is really meant to help to balance those, to bring them into balance in a way that with a waterfall method or a more traditional method, basically, you've locked in more or less usually an expectation of cost for sure and speed most likely for when that's going to be delivered by, because it's a fixed project.
Right.
At the same time, that doesn't necessarily mean that quality-wise, that, like you say, when there's a misunderstanding somewhere, how many scope change forms are you going to fill out, and how happy are you going to be with that process? And I think that side by side with that, so I've spent a lot of time in e-commerce, and some of this is just the level of complexity of different systems interacting. So you say, we're going to build this Magento site and we're going to use these 7 extensions to meet the deliverables. And it turns out that 3 of the extensions don't work together. Now, what do? Is the deliverable just that you installed them and you handed over the project and the thing doesn't work? Or do you go back to the drawing board and reevaluate? It's the same way that, you plan to integrate or let's say to migrate some data over and there are issues with the data. Do you just move it over as is and, leave problems, or do you resolve them? Things that you don't necessarily anticipate before the project starts. The same, you go to integrate that point of sale system and you figure out that there are some additional needs there that weren't uncovered because you never really talked to the team that deals with the retail stores and and get all of their particular requirements, because those were never disclosed fully until they see it and understand. They don't know what they haven't told you yet.
Exactly.
So there's this whole hodgepodge, and being able to continually reprioritize and say, look, we don't really need gift cards for launch, but we really need those reward points. Let's put more time into fixing the reward point system to work the way that we need, and let's leave off this other thing for phase 2 or whatever. And we'll try to stay within the original budgeting, and the original timeline, but something's got to give somewhere. Getting people to understand that they're basically buying labor and expertise, and it's more like they're in house employees, that we're all human beings, that there's a finite, we can only do what we can do, and that things are in constant flux. And I think teams that do a good job of sort of getting out in front of that, it's almost the risk analysis for the project. Where can this project go wrong? Well, if you don't hand us the content in a timely fashion, or, if you don't, make certain, often, as much as things could go wrong on the web development side or something else, the clients understanding that they're stakeholders and that they play just as important a role in making sure that the deliverable is good and timely and cost effective. It's it's tantamount to success.
Yeah. Agile has a way of kicking up dust. And that's really what it's good for. It forces issues out into the open because you have to communicate all the time. And again, all the rituals are about communication, really. One of the rituals typically for a Scrum team is a daily stand-up. Everyone gets up, on the team gets up and says what they're going to do that day, whether they have issues, whether they didn't get something done, that sort of thing. And, if there's issues, the Scrum Master takes them away, or otherwise people get together and try to solve them. And, it's not so much that you have to have a stand-up, even though that's standard issue requirement. You say you're a Scrum team, you got to have a stand-up. It's that if you're communicating, you're going to have one anyway. You're going to want one. You're going to say, we got to communicate, we got to talk about this. We got to get this out in the open.
Yeah, because you have to be heads down and actually get development done, or whatever else, get research done, get whatever needs to be done, database work, whatever it may be. And so if you don't set a time to check in and see where everybody is and if somebody's stuck and if things need to shift or whatever's going on, then you're not really helping each other. I mean, ideally a Scrum team, one of these teams is self-sufficient. It's made up of the people that are going to be required to get the work done, and without having to lean on other teams or other departments or other things outside of getting feedback from stakeholders and that sort of thing. So, and I one of the things that I've always loved about it is getting to the point of, so you go through the process, you figure out how many points or however you want to break this up, big tasks, little tasks. They go into some sort of a backlog where they're prioritized, so that, we know what's the most important in terms of bringing value to the stakeholders and so on and so forth. The team knocks those out, but then there's a retrospective, a post-mortem, if you will. That you're going to go back and you're going to take a look and you're going to see, basically a review. What went well, what didn't go well, how can we do this differently, above and beyond just pure QA, pure quality assurance testing. The goal is for the team to continually get better. And I think that sometimes, folks don't want to acknowledge that when they're hiring experts, often at a premium hourly rate, that their projects are custom. And like you say, like I mentioned earlier, you put these integrations together that haven't been put together before, and the outcome is unique. And the work that needs to be done to address that is unique. People don't realize that they've become a form of tech company, whether they realized it or not, that this is not all prefab that they're often dealing with. That it's the same with design work. If you don't approve the first draft of a design, it doesn't mean that the designer did a bad job. That often that's what it takes. There's going to be some back and forth. There's going to be feedback. You need to be able to provide, clear, concise feedback. And when you come back a few days later, because you showed it to some other people in your team who felt totally differently, on the client side, and now that, and so now this client is asking for you to go back to the drawing board again. Well, you can go backwards on approved designs. You can do things, but it will have an impact. Nothing comes from nothing. So I think that's all part of for me, I just spouted out a whole bunch of things there, but that feedback loop, that learning and growing, that understanding that this is not about things always being perfect, but it's about things continually getting better, more efficient. And in tech, there's always new tech. If you want to be cutting edge, you're going to have to, be open to the fact that there's going to be some learning happening.
Yeah. It retrospectives can be tricky because one of the problems that you might have with a mature team is that, there's sayings about every time a team has a retrospective, the idea is after the sprint's over and you've done your deliverables or haven't, if you failed, you talk about, what you did in the sprint, what you could do better. If you've met all your deliverables, what went well, what didn't, what can you improve? If you didn't meet all your deliverables, same thing. There's times though with mature teams where, the retrospective is happening as the problems are cropping up. Right, because you're communicating well and you trust each other and the business owner trusts you, right? Likewise with typically, again, there's a rule of thumb that you meet with the business a couple times, maybe 10% of the time in the sprint, 5%, something like that, to talk about requirements, right? Just requirements of what they need and getting ready for the next sprint and what's their priorities because they might have changed and things like that. If you're working closely with a business owner and they trust you and it's a mature relationship, you might not need that time, right? But again, the principle is you have things like a retrospective and you have certain rituals about requirement sessions and demos for the business owner because it forces you to have, it creates a space for communication because communication is the most important thing. You've got to make sure that you're communicating constantly and the rituals all are meant to do that. And even when it runs in conflict to the quote unquote right way to do Agile, the point is if you're communicating, you're probably doing it right. Even if your retrospective only lasts 10 minutes because you've already said all you had to say over the previous week, right? Which can happen, right? If something goes wrong and you can't deliver, you might have hashed it out pretty well already. And the retrospective says, yeah, we talked it over and why QA couldn't get something done was partly because engineers didn't get it to them fast enough or whatever, or the engineers took on too much and we shouldn't take on that much, whatever reason it happens to be. So.
I mean, at the same time, having a closed team working on a project, I think also lends itself to a little bit more success with some of these things. When you're talking about, and so we deal with this in web hosting. Right. We have a support ticket queue. We answer extremely quickly. That's part of why people come, and choose JetRails. And the thinking there is that you're asking for something that's a more finite need that a support technician can 9 out of 10 times knock out themselves quickly. We've got really high level techs that are at the front lines. And so the fastest thing to do is to just have someone there for you that, first available person should be able to assist you and address it. And we built a team around that. On the other hand, when we're onboarding a customer, that's that project of onboarding of standing up the hosting environment, getting all the files and databases migrated over, testing, adjusting, configuring, optimizing, and especially when we're talking about auto-scaling environments, some of the larger environments, and with big spending thousands of dollars, tens of thousands of dollars a month in web hosting, where we really want to work on optimizing, not just for things like security and speed and what have you, but for cost. Where we do not, want them to be just spending more money than they should be or need to be
right.
on bandwidth or raw infrastructure because we aren't caching enough or we aren't compressing enough or leveraging certain systems well enough. We'd much rather have a dedicated person when we can that's going to be assigned to that project that's going to help see it from start to finish. And I think that that's also something that sometimes gets misunderstood, that there are a lot of projects out there where it's just first available, and so first available dev is going to work on this. And more often than not, when you're dealing with an agile team, there's a team that's assigned to the project from the get-go, and they're going to see it through fruition. They understand what was done previously, going back to a previous statement of yours. They understand a lot of that history of at least whatever the finite project is. In a really big project, there might be multiple teams working on multiple feature sets or things that are happening, let's say all roll up into the Facebook app, right? It's not just one. I can imagine how many Scrum teams Facebook has or the equivalent thereof, exactly whatever methodology or terminology is in use. There are concepts at play that really, really work well for this particular industry. And I think sometimes it takes some education into the value, but once you do it, it feels pretty good. So think about that. Are there situations that you've seen where, where trying to adopt this type of methodology fell apart, where this didn't work for a particular group, where people didn't want to work together in Scrum teams, or within an organization, maybe there wasn't buy-in from the leadership, and it could never really amount to much.
Well,
have you run into any train wrecks?
Well, I mean, there've been train wrecks. They weren't necessarily because of Agile. It was sort of coincidental. Sort of dying with Agile, not because of Agile. It's not generally been the methodology that's been the problem. Although now that I'm thinking about it, you've kind of brought some things to memory.
Sorry, I know.
No,
I try
okay.
to keep some of those buried really deep.
Yeah, I know,
I'm sure,
I do.
like most of us, but I have a way of surfacing them.
Yeah, like I said, it kicks up dust. So the problem wasn't so much Agile, and the problem wasn't so much that people didn't have a buy-in. It's that the communication with the right stakeholders wasn't consistent. I was with a consulting firm, not Leventis, a different one. And the process was to go from the team to people in managing the people we were making the product for, because it was an internal application, and a lot of back and forth with people on our consulting company. Weren't there every day. So the problem was you had roadblocks to communication. So we find out as we're working, thinking we're iterating in the way that the client or the ultimate customer, the ultimate user needs. But, there was a breakdown, sort of a game of telephone, where they didn't really, they weren't really telling the person they were dealing with everything. So we didn't get all the information from the person they were dealing with at their own company. And that person wasn't dealing with us directly. He was going through sort of a project manager, not project manager, like a sort of a client manager,
sort of account
right?
manager. Yeah.
Yeah. That's what I mean. Yeah. And so it was really that breakdown. So it wasn't really that we didn't do things right in 3-week sprints. It's that they thought they were going to get one thing in a 3-week sprint, but they never spoke to us directly about it. It was this, or they did, but it was, it was sort of like they weren't like fully open with us. And so we couldn't really be fully open with our answers, and it was because there were people trying to manage the relationship. So that I think was more of a consulting problem, just a client consultant type problem.
So I rewatched with some coworkers virtually the film Office Space recently, and see, okay, okay, and one of there's just so many lines there that, and especially I think for folks that have worked in these industries for long enough to remember. A lot of the references. Because there are things that don't necessarily translate as well. For the younger generations now, there's some almost inside jokes for some of us. But there's a character who has to describe what his purpose is and what value he brings to this larger company. And he's there sitting there describing, well, I translate things from the customer to the engineers, and and that basically the engineers, the suggestion there being given is that they're not really as good at communication, and that's not who customers want to talk to, and so on. Somewhere in there, of course, this is all a big comedy, and so they're talking about how, well, how many customers do you talk to? Well, I don't actually talk to the customers. My secretary does that. And he's sitting there trying to explain how he brings value, and it's extremely difficult for him. And I think that sometimes, we forget that the game of telephone applies everywhere. There is some beauty in the simplicity of having the developers actually be able to talk to the customer, the stakeholders. Be able to actually understand what their goals are, ask them direct questions, maybe not on a daily basis, maybe not even on a weekly basis, but on an ongoing basis. or as needed to have that going.
It needs to be open too, and they can't hold back and not tell you things because someone said, well, don't bring this up because that'll get them off track. We want them to do this. It has to be open communication, right? And you try to facilitate that, and regular meetings, maybe you're right, maybe once a week, every couple of weeks, or just usually when when Agile's really worked, we've had a very good representative of the end customer. And when it hasn't worked, we've had a poor representative of the end customer. And usually the good representative is one of the end customers, someone who just sort of, takes a leadership role, right? Mm-hmm. They manage a team of 7 people who do something, and there's 3 other managers, and this one of the managers they've been appointed to be the representative for all the teams. And that's usually when it works. Yeah. When it's kind of someone like a project manager from the outside who only sees units of work and doesn't really see the work itself, that's when it's always been a problem. That's when we've always had issues.
And the people, it's like almost the phrase "eat your own dog food," right? The people that are going to have to use this, that know what their trials and tribulations are, what their challenges are on a day-to-day basis. If you don't pull together the stakeholders in a proper way on the stakeholder side, this is on the client, right? Because they have whoever's representing them, that you as the consultancy or agency, you're not talking to 20 people in their company on an ongoing basis, but they've got so let's say in e-commerce, there's, let's say, a shipping manager in the company, there are merchandisers, there are marketers, all of these people have input into the operations of this website and what their needs and what their goals are. And if no one is representing any of that, again, you get to the point of deployment and something's not addressed properly. It's all back to communication, right? You hit the nail on the head earlier.
Yep. It's about communicating things clearly and openly and sort of setting expectations. We had one project, when I say one project, one group I was in where we really got Agile working well is our teams were very good. The teams functioned as a group of 6 or 8, and we had several teams all working on different things, but in the same sort of area. But it was sort of decided that we needed to see the customers more because we were in one office in Chicago and they were in another office out in the suburbs, all our users. And we really needed to go work with them and talk to them because we were very good when someone sent us a bug or requirement and taking it down and breaking it down, delivering it in 2 weeks and doing all that, right? And so a few of us went out to the company, to the other office, and just sort of sat and watched them work for a day. It's kind of all we did. Mm-hmm. And that was very valuable because we could see them work. And we realized this one area where we were always finding bugs, and our QA teams were always saying, well, this still doesn't work right. So no, we got to get this right for the customer. No one really used that feature. No one actually did it. It was this very complicated way to do on-the-fly queries of data. And they didn't use it. They just they had 8 standard queries that we gave. They just used those. They were fine with that. They needed to do anything they might put in Excel. So what they really needed was a way to get stuff in Excel, and then they could, slice and dice it. They didn't need us to do it on their. And
they didn't need you to build this big custom,
Exactly. They didn't need it.
Module.
They were fine.
Yeah.
Right. And so there's always room for revelations, and this was at a place where, people were generally happy with what we produced, and they were happy that we cleared out bugs and we fixed things for them. But there were a lot of things that we were sort of self-reporting and worried about and concerned with that just made no difference to them, and they didn't really notice it because they didn't use it. They didn't see, every month or so when we'd release that there'd been this improvement to this module because they didn't use it, So it was interesting like that. So.
Yeah, no, I think that does a pretty good job of lining up why these kinds of project management styles like Agile have become more prevalent, because you really, in order to not just meet the expectation of the invoice of some fixed statement of work, you really have to continually spend time understanding what the customer's real goals are. And those goals are in flux and they're changing. And, it's really, if you can keep your eye on that ball, you can have a much deeper, much longer term relationship with a client, and really shine in a different way, instead of being a commodity or completely transactional. You're an extension of their business.
Yeah, yeah.
And when, a lot of these things that we've talked about, I think, if you start just talking about with a business, I'll stick with e-com for a second, a retailer, a wholesaler, a manufacturer, whatever kind of brand, or the same would apply, let's say, what would we deal with on CMS systems like Drupal and WordPress, whether it's a college or university, something in higher education, whether it's, a hospital or something in health. If you just start talking about Scrum Masters and story points, and there's a lot of buzzwords that get pushed around in the Agile world, they're going to pull back. And they're going to be like, whoa, like, we don't know what it's bad enough we have to learn all these e-commerce, conversion rate optimization. Okay. And deal with all of these other things. But, now you want to get us to be experts in that. No, thank you. But if you just tell them, look, we've got communication here to keep the lines of communication open. This is going to be your point of contact. They're going to continually make sure that whatever your highest priorities are our highest priorities. We're going to work like an extension of your team in that way. And if you present it well, who wouldn't want it, right? And if they don't, almost, is that really the best client? Is that really going to lead down the best path if they want your expertise to be completely commoditized?
Yeah.
When you're there to work as a managed service provider, and to bring them more unique value.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So, I think that's sometimes, the interesting part, that more people know about what they want than what it's called.
Well, I think, you're right. I think when you explain things to people, both like you said in terms of communication, but also in terms of, what do you actually have to do? Like, what are you doing? What's the point of whatever you want to build? How does it help you? What does your business need to do? If you put it in that sense, and then you go back to some of the stories and some of the research and so on that sort of, some of the writings that sort of led various people to develop the Agile methodology, that led, groups of business consultants to consider, let's put all this knowledge together into a package so we can explain it to people. When you go back to those original stories, then I think people get it. So if you tell the story about Habitat for Humanity and building a house, a prefab house, then they get it. If you go back to the story of, one of the stories was, at Pearl Harbor, right? All of a sudden, everyone's at war. We had to get, they needed to get the boat out. So guys just started showing up at the docks and started doing work, right? And so that was how that happened, was well studied during and after the war. And those studies made it to various business schools, and people at those business schools are the ones who started to develop, methodologies about how to be productive. So when you go back to stories like that, in stories that you have from your own, like, working at that publishing company, all the chaos and putting barcodes on books and how hard that was for a month. When you come at it like that, then they'll understand. We're going to break it down into tasks. We're going to deliver something every 2 weeks. We're going to have to meet with you a couple times a week. We'll set the times. We'll keep it, we'll keep a time contract of an hour and a half, whatever it is. Then they get it. I think you're right. If you start calling them backlog groomings and retrospectives and deliverables, then they don't get it. But if you say, okay, we're going to have this much done here, and then you sort of explain as you go what the terminology is. Or if you get one person on that team out of the 20 people you're building it for to just say, okay, here's what a story is and here's how you write it, right? Then I think you're in good shape. I think because it has to go back, though, to something practical, because the methodology doesn't work because it was well constructed and there's nice terminology and it's exciting to talk about. It was constructed because it's what works in real life. When you have a crisis and you have a problem, what works in real life is people getting together, figuring out what they need to do, breaking things down into smaller tasks, appreciating unknowns, respecting unknowns, respecting the amount of time they have to get something done. And how you can't conceive of the final product, you got to conceive of it in steps, and that I think is what's important.
Yeah, And the concepts, which I come back to, it's really simple stuff,
Yeah.
Back to what I do when I'm not taping podcast episodes,
Right.
In web hosting, there are vendors that provide a commodity. They provide infrastructure. In some cases, we use them as backbones. We can host people on AWS, on DigitalOcean. You can go straight to these, but for the most part, you're not really getting a service layer team. You're getting raw infrastructure. And the same with a lot of the tools that we use for clients, whether it's Cloudflare or Sakuri or Sansec or, the list goes on and on. It's how you set these things up and how you maintain them and manage them and monitor them and what you do with them and how you pull them together that brings value. And so, there are a number of reasons why people switch web hosting. Support issues, loading speed, scalability and being able to handle bursts of traffic. Like this is all common. One of the most common reasons in 2020 that we run into simply just comes down to the environment being able to be tailored to what the user needs. And I would say that some of our best feeding grounds, as it turns out, are web hosts that have more prefabricated environments where your website or application has to work with with what that environment can do, as opposed to the environment being architected around what your application is meant to do. And so that causes a lot of friction, a lot of headaches, a lot of problems for dev teams, and eventually we wind up with a lot of dev partners that will say, look, we've tried to get this working over here. Let's move this over to JetRails, and we know it's going to work better. We know we're going to clear roadblocks that way. That's not what everyone is looking for. Apparently, I mean, we've got no shortage of competition out there, right? It's but we know that it's what works best for us, for the business that we're trying to operate in terms of high levels of customer success, high levels of retention, and just overall, a strong reputation. It's easier to provide a commodity. It's a lot harder to have low attrition and strong reviews and reputation and accolades providing a commodity. Who likes their cable company, right? It's infrastructure, but it's very hard to be really in that winning position. So I think that it absolutely, while more people think about these sorts of things when it comes to web design and web development and the things that a team like Leventis has expertise in and does day in and day out. I think that in a lot of the tech world, it's kind of understood that a lot of these principles still apply, regardless of what our deliverables are, and we can't always apply necessarily we might have more of an agile philosophy. We can't always apply maybe a Scrum methodology to everything that we do. But that at the heart of all of it, it comes right back to, and I've used the word over and over again, bringing value to the stakeholders, to the clients. And if we can always keep a focus on doing that, then we're doing a lot right. That's why we like working with like-minded teams. So many great partners like Leventis that fit that or maybe break the mold as opposed to fitting the mold. We want to stick with that agile kind of thing. I shouldn't put any of us into a prefab mold. But this has been a pleasure. Matt, any final words of wisdom before we wrap the episode?
I think just understanding the key is Agile forces issues into the open so they can be communicated. That fundamentally gets past almost everyone's complaints about it. Because if you say on your team, we're going to impose an Agile methodology, we're going to start using sprints, and we're going to have Scrum masters and so on and so forth, there's going to be a good portion of people who are going to complain about buzzwords and fads and how annoying it is to go to a story and how you can't do what you do in 2 weeks. It just won't work, and so on and so forth. if you get people to understand the purpose of it, then I think a lot of those complaints and objections sort of fall away. And people start to realize there's a value in communicating so often and so, in such a certain way. And all of a sudden they realize, well, okay, I guess as an engineer, I would have liked to have spent a month just building this framework, but probably it's better if I do it, I put up a prototype in 2 weeks and show it to everybody. Because I might build this framework and it might be crazy, and the people actually have to build with it, the other engineers on other teams, might not like it, right? So it forces them to communicate what they want to do. And it forces, business to say, well, we've got a couple weeks, we're going to get set up, we're going to get started, we're going to start building an infrastructure for you about how we build our app and deploy it to a website and so on. And we're going to get the first stories rolling with the 1 or 2 people to come talk to you, a QA maybe and a business analyst, and we're going to talk to you about what you want. And they might say, well, we know what we want. We put it in the proposal. We have it all for you. Why can't you just start working? But then they see, in 2 weeks, they've raised a lot of questions about exactly what to do on the website, whether or not you have a gift card, like you were saying, whether or not you have reward points. And so people start to see that forcing all these rituals and forcing all this communication and forcing you to come to decisions that are going to be maybe judged in 2 weeks, it really is better overall. It's not really the rituals that matter. It's the fact that you're forcing issues out in the open. That, to me, is what the value is for Agile, and it's something probably you should be doing all the time anyway. If
you've got the rub, right?
Yeah, it's not so special, really, when you think about it. If you're just sort of a lone consultant working on your own, you've got to be talking to the client on a regular basis. You don't have a BA, you don't have a Scrum Master. It's just you. But you still got to force out in the open what the client needs, and you've got to force them to think about what they need. And if you've got, if you're managing a team of 40, all working on a big project for some big company, you've got to force those into smaller teams, working in smaller groups and smaller tasks, just to force all these things out in the open. That to me is fundamentally what to remember when people start throwing out the buzzwords for Agile and things. That's really what they want. They want things out in the open, communicated, and dealt with handily.
I don't want to insult anyone who I've done business with in the past, but I don't think I've ever quite seen an RFP, a request for proposal in the e-commerce industry that answered my questions.
No, it won't. It won't.
If I was going to shop for a new house and was going to go to a contractor to build it from the ground up, I don't think that my list of requirements would answer all the contractor's questions either. There's a reason why you're hiring experts, and communication absolutely is key. So, Matt, thank you so much for coming on the podcast here. I hope we get to chat like this again sometime soon. For our listeners, feel free to leave feedback wherever you find us, LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook @JetRails. We always love to hear from you. And you can subscribe to our podcast wherever you listen to find podcasts. We hope to hear from you soon. Happy selling and stay safe out there.